Evelyn watched in horror as the bodies of her friends collapsed one by one, her fingers gripping the gun so tightly her knuckles turned white. The infected had swarmed them without warning, their gaping maws and rotting limbs a terrifying sight. She would never unsee tears stream down her face as she fired round after round, the echoes of the gunshots deafening in the eerie silence. Just minutes ago, they had been so close to the safe zone, their destination within reach. Now, they were trapped, surrounded by the endless horde of undead, with no clear path to escape. Evelyn knew her ammunition was dwindling and her strength waning, but she refused to give up, not when they had come so far. Steeling her resolve, she glanced around, searching for any sign of hope. Her gaze landed on a crumbling overpass in the distance. If she could make it there, she might be able to lose the horde and find a way across the river to the safe zone, but the path was treacherous, and the undead showed no signs of relenting. With a deep breath, Evelyn took one last look at the lifeless bodies of her companions and made a choice. She would have to go alone from this point on. Her survival depended solely on her own wits and abilities. The weight of that realization settled heavily in her chest, but she pushed it aside. There would be time to mourn later. Evelyn surged forward, dodging the grasping hands of the infected as she sprinted towards the overpass. Her legs burned and her lungs ached, but she refused to slow down. The undead followed close behind, their snarls and groans echoing all around her. Glancing over her shoulder, Evelyn saw the horde gaining ground, panic rising in her chest. Just as she reached the base of the overpass, she spotted a flash of movement in the distance. At first, she thought it was more of the infected, but as she squinted her eyes, she made out the silhouettes of other survivors. Evelyn's heart leaped with hope. Perhaps she wasn't as alone as she had feared. Mustering the last of her strength, she waved her arms, trying to catch their attention. The group seemed to notice her, and Evelyn felt a surge of relief. But as they drew closer, she realized with a sinking feeling that they were not friendly survivors at all. They were armed and dangerous, their expressions hard and their eyes filled with suspicion. Evelyn froze, unsure of what to do. Should she try to join them or keep running and risk being caught by the undead? Before she could decide, the group opened fire. Evelyn ducked behind a concrete barrier as bullets whizzed past her head. She cursed under her breath. Those people were no allies. They were scavengers, or worse, members of some violent faction fighting for control. In this decimated world, she was on her own. Hearing the infected drawing nearer, Evelyn knew she had no choice but to keep moving. Her legs shook from exhaustion, but she forced herself onward, climbing the crumbling overpass one step at a time. The undead closed in behind her, their moans and snarls filling the air. Evelyn's heart pounded in her ears as she neared the top, praying she could lose them on the other side. Just as she reached the apex, Evelyn froze in horror. The sight that greeted her sent a chill down her spine. The once bustling city now lay in ruins, the streets choked with the bodies of the infected. Worse still, she could see a massive horde gathering in the distance. Drawn by the commotion, Evelyn realized with sinking dread that the safe zone she had been searching for might be nothing more than a fantasy. Evelyn's heart sank as she surveyed the devastation before her. The safe zone she had risked everything to reach now seemed hopelessly out of reach, trapped on the crumbling overpass. With the undead horde closing in behind her, she felt a wave of despair wash over her. Had she come all this way only to meet her end here? Just then, Evelyn noticed movement in the distance below the overpass. Squinting her eyes, she made out the forms of other survivors making their way through the streets, gripping her gun tightly. She called out to them, desperate for any chance at reaching safety. The group paused at the sound of her voice, and Evelyn held her breath, praying they would help her. After a moment's hesitation, the survivors began to make their way towards the overpass. Evelyn sagged with relief, but as they drew closer, she noticed something off about them. Their movements were cautious, and their expressions guarded. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that these people were not to be trusted, but with the undead horde swiftly approaching, she had little choice but to take the risk. As the group reached the base of the overpass, Evelyn called down to them, pleading for their assistance. The survivors conferred briefly before one of them, a tall man with a hard gaze, beckoned her to come down. Steeling her nerves, Evelyn began to make her descent. The survivors watched her approach, their eyes scanning her warily. Evelyn couldn't help but notice that one of them, a younger man with a shaved head, kept glancing around nervously As if expecting trouble, narrowing her eyes, Evelyn approached the tall man, who seemed to be the leader of the group. Before she could speak, the man held up a hand. Cutting her off, his voice was gruff as he demanded to know where she had come from and what she was doing alone on the overpass. Evelyn hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal, but the urgency of the situation left her little choice. She quickly explained about the horde behind her and her desperation to reach the safe zone. The man considered her words, his brow furrowed in thought. After a long moment, he nodded and gestured for the others to follow him. Evelyn felt a flicker of hope as she fell into step behind them, but it was short-lived. As they made their way through the streets, Evelyn noticed the younger man, the one with the shaved head, continually looking over his shoulder, a nervous energy radiating from him. Evelyn quickened her pace until she was walking beside the tall man. She opened her mouth to ask about the young man's behavior, but the words died on her lips as she caught sight of a familiar figure in the distance. A chill ran down her spine as she recognized the tattered clothes and shambling gait of an infected person. Her stomach turned as she realized it was one of her former companions, the one she had been forced to leave behind. Evelyn stopped in her tracks, her eyes fixed on the shambling figure. She felt a wave of guilt and sorrow wash over her. Even in death, her friends were not at peace. Now they were doomed to wander this decimated world forever. In that moment, Evelyn knew she could never truly outrun the ghosts of her past. The tall man paused and turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the sound of a gunshot rent the air. The young man with the shaved head had broken away from the group and was firing at the infected figure, his face twisted in a snarl of rage. Evelyn watched in horror as the bullet found its mark and the infected body crumpled to the ground. The other survivors reacted with alarm, some reaching for their own weapons. Evelyn held up her hands in a placating gesture, but the damage was done. The betrayal had been laid bare, and Evelyn knew in that moment that she could trust no one, not even the very people who had promised to help her. Evelyn stared in stunned silence as the young man with the shaved head lowered his gun, his chest heaving with ragged breaths. The other survivors were all regarding him with wary suspicion, their hands inching towards their own weapons. Evelyn felt a pit of dread forming in her stomach as she realized the fragile alliance she had forged with this group was now in jeopardy. The tall man, who seemed to be the leader of the group, stepped forward. His eyes narrowed as he fixed the young man with a piercing glare. Evelyn held her breath, waiting for the confrontation that seemed inevitable. The tension in the air was palpable as the two men stared each other down, neither willing to make the first move. After what felt like an eternity, the tall man finally spoke, his voice low and measured. He demanded to know what the hell the young man thought he was doing, putting them all at risk with his reckless actions. The young man's expression darkened as he spat back a defiant response, claiming that the infected abomination deserved to die. Evelyn could see the tall man's jaw tightening as he struggled to maintain his composure. He warned the young man that his actions threatened to draw the attention of the undead horde that was still nearby. The group's precarious position growing more perilous by the minute. The young man scoffed, seemingly unconcerned by the very real danger they faced. Evelyn felt her heart racing as she watched the confrontation unfold. She wanted to interject to try and defuse the situation, but she knew her voice would likely be drowned out by the heated exchange between the two men. Glancing around anxiously, she noticed the other survivors shifting uneasily, their hands drifting closer to their weapons. Evelyn realized with a sinking feeling that the trust she had placed in this group was rapidly crumbling. Just as it seemed the argument would come to blows, a new voice called out from the shadows. Evelyn whirled around to see a figure step out from behind a pile of debris, the dim light casting eerie shadows across their face. The survivors all tensed at the newcomer's sudden appearance, hands hovering over their guns. The figure raised their hands in a placating gesture, and Evelyn was relieved to see that they appeared unarmed. As the person drew closer, Evelyn caught a glimpse of a woman's face, her features sharp and her gaze intense. She introduced herself as Zara and claimed that she had been observing the group from a safe vantage point. Zara's eyes swept over the survivors, her expression unreadable. She remarked calmly that their bickering was sure to draw the attention of the undead horde, and that if they wished to survive, they would be wise to put aside their differences and work together Evelyn felt a flicker of hope at the woman's words. Perhaps there was still a chance for them to make it to the safe zone after all. The tall man regarded Zara warily, but Evelyn could see the tension in his posture starting to ease. The young man with the shaved head, however, remained defiant. His eyes narrowed in suspicion. Zara fixed him with an unwavering stare, and Evelyn held her breath, waiting to see how the confrontation would unfold. At last the tall man nodded curtly and gestured for the group to follow Zara. As she turned and melted back into the shadows, Evelyn fell into step behind them, her mind racing with questions. Who was this mysterious woman? And could she truly be trusted to lead them to safety? Glancing over her shoulder, Evelyn caught sight of the young man, his expression dark and unreadable. She couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. Evelyn followed closely behind Zara as the group navigated the treacherous streets of the decimated city. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the constant moans of the undead. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine as they moved stealthily through the shadows, wary of drawing the attention of the infected horde. Zara led them through a maze of crumbling buildings and abandoned vehicles, her pace steady and her movements sure-footed. Evelyn marveled at the woman's confidence, wondering how she had managed to survive this long in such a hostile environment. Glancing around at the other survivors, Evelyn noticed that they too seemed to be putting their trust in Zara despite the lingering tension that had followed them from their previous confrontation. As they rounded a corner, Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The group had arrived at the gates of a heavily fortified compound, the imposing walls and armed guards a stark contrast to the desolation that surrounded them. Zara turned to face the survivors, her expression grave. She explained that this was the compound controlled by a ruthless faction known as the Reapers, a group that had seized power in the aftermath of the outbreak. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine at the mention of the Reapers. Their reputation for brutality and violence was well known, even in the far reaches of the decimated city. Zara went on to say that the Reapers had established their stronghold here, and that they guarded it fiercely. Any who dared to challenge their authority were swiftly dealt with. Evelyn's heart sank as she realized the enormity of the task ahead of them. How could they possibly hope to infiltrate such a heavily fortified compound? Zara seemed to sense Evelyn's trepidation, and she reached out to place a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The woman's gaze was intense as she looked around at the group, her voice lowering to a hushed whisper. She revealed that she had a plan to infiltrate the compound, a daring mission that would allow them to bypass the Reapers' defenses and reach the safe zone on the other side. Evelyn felt a surge of hope, but she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at her since she had first encountered this mysterious woman. What if Zara's true motives were not as altruistic as she claimed? What if this was all part of some larger conspiracy? Before Evelyn could voice her concerns, Zara was already outlining the details of her plan. The group would split up and approach the compound from different angles, creating a distraction that would allow a small team to slip inside undetected. Once they reached the safe zone, they could then open the gates and allow the rest of the survivors to join them. The other members of the group seemed to be warming to Zara's proposal, but Evelyn couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled in the pit of her stomach. She watched as the tall man and the young man with the shaved head engaged in a hushed discussion, their expressions intense. Evelyn couldn't help but wonder if they too were harboring doubts about Zara's true intentions. As the group began to disperse to prepare for the mission, Evelyn found herself falling into step beside the young man. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, but Evelyn could see the tension in his posture. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the young man turned to her, his eyes narrowed suspiciously. "You're not the only one who's had their trust betrayed," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Be careful who you put your faith in." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine as the implication of his words sank in. She couldn't help but wonder if she had made a grave mistake in placing her trust in Zara and the others. What if the true threat wasn't the undead horde or the Reapers, but the very people she had come to rely on? Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she followed Zara and the rest of the group towards the heavily fortified compound of the Reapers. The plan was audacious, a high-stakes gamble, that could either deliver them to the promised safe zone or lead them straight into a deadly trap. Glancing around at her fellow survivors, Evelyn could see the same mixture of fear and determination etched on their faces. As they approached the perimeter of the compound, Zara raised a hand signaling the group to halt. She quickly outlined the final details of the mission, reminding them all to stick to their assigned roles and to be ready to move at a moment's notice. Evelyn felt a bead of sweat roll down her back as she listened, her mind racing with 1,000 scenarios, each one more dire than the last. Zara then gestured for the team assigned to the initial distraction to take their positions. Evelyn watched as the tall man and a few others broke off, disappearing into the shadows. She caught a glimpse of the young man with the shaved head as he too slipped away, his gaze briefly meeting hers before he vanished into the night. Evelyn couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at her since their last conversation. With a deep breath, Evelyn turned her attention back to Zara, the other woman's eyes locking with hers. Zara placed a reassuring hand on Evelyn's shoulder, her voice low and steady. "It's time. Are you ready?" Evelyn swallowed hard and nodded, steeling her nerves as she followed Zara and the remaining members of the group towards the compound gates. The sound of gunfire and explosions suddenly rent the air, causing Evelyn to flinch. Zara quickened her pace, gesturing for the others to do the same. As they reached the gates, Evelyn could see the Reaper's guards scrambling to respond to the disturbance, their attention diverted for the moment. Zara wasted no time taking advantage of the opening. She quickly led the group to a concealed entrance on the far side of the compound, and Evelyn felt a surge of hope as they slipped inside undetected. But as they moved deeper into the compound, Evelyn's sense of unease only grew. The corridors were eerily silent, and there was an unsettling lack of activity. Zara moved with purpose, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led into a trap. She glanced around at the other survivors, each of them seemingly lost in their own thoughts, their expressions grim. Suddenly Zara came to a halt, her hand raised in a silent command. The group froze as a faint sound reached their ears. At first Evelyn couldn't make it out, but as they strained to listen, the unmistakable moans of the infected became audible. Zara's eyes narrowed as she gestured for the group to take cover. Evelyn followed the others as they ducked behind a row of crates, her heart pounding in her ears. She held her breath, listening as the sounds of the undead grew closer. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as a sinking feeling of dread settled in the pit of her stomach. Something was very wrong here. As the infected shambled into view, Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. The creatures were unlike anything she had seen before. Their movements were unnaturally fast, and their features twisted into a horrifying parody of humanity. Evelyn watched in horror as one of the survivors tried to engage them, only to be easily overpowered and torn apart. Zara's voice rang out, then her words laced with a hint of triumph. "Welcome to the Reaper's laboratory. Welcome to the future." Evelyn's world seemed to tilt on its axis as the full weight of Zara's words sank in. The Reapers had been engineering these monstrosities all along, and they had led her and the others straight into the heart of their twisted experiments. Trapped and outnumbered, Evelyn knew that their only hope of survival now rested on their ability to escape the Reaper's deadly creation. Evelyn's mind raced as she watched the genetically modified infected creatures advance on them, their unnatural speed and ferocity a terrifying sight to behold. She gripped her weapon tightly, her knuckles turning white as Zara's chilling words echoed in her mind. The Reapers had been experimenting on the infected, creating these horrifying hybrid abominations, and now they were trapped in the heart of the Reaper's twisted laboratory. Glancing around at the other survivors, Evelyn could see the same overwhelming fear and uncertainty mirrored on their faces. They had come so far, risking everything to reach the promised safe zone, only to stumble into this nightmarish scenario. Evelyn felt a surge of panic as she realized they had been led into a deadly trap, one from which they might not escape. As the hybrid creatures drew closer, Evelyn caught sight of movement out of the corner of her eye. One of the survivors had broken from cover and was firing wildly at the approaching horde. Evelyn cursed under her breath as the gunshots echoed through the corridors, drawing the attention of even more of the twisted abominations. The group scattered, instinctively taking cover wherever they could find it. Evelyn crouched behind a stack of crates, her heart pounding in her ears. She could hear the snarls and howls of the infected as they converged on her position, sending a chill down her spine. She knew they had to find a way out of this nightmare, but with the Reapers clearly in control of these monstrosities, their chances of survival were dwindling by the second. Zara's voice rang out then, her tone calm and collected despite the chaos unfolding around them. "You fools, did you really think you could escape us? These creatures are my legacy, my gift to the New World Order." Evelyn clenched her jaw in anger. How could this woman, who had promised to guide them to safety, have betrayed them so thoroughly? She risked a glance over the crate, and her blood ran cold as she saw the hybrid creatures tearing the other survivors apart with terrifying ease. Evelyn felt a wave of nausea wash over her as she realized that their chances of making it out of this alive were growing slimmer by the moment. As the infected horde drew closer, Evelyn's mind raced, trying to come up with a way to escape. She knew they had to get as far away from the Reaper's compound as possible, but with the twisted hybrid creatures blocking their path and Zara's forces closing in from all sides, their options were severely limited. Just then Evelyn spotted a set of double doors at the far end of the corridor. They appeared to lead deeper into the compound, a risky path to be sure, but perhaps their only chance at survival. Swallowing her fear, Evelyn steeled her nerves and made a break for the doors, her weapon blazing as she tried to create an opening for the others to follow. The hybrid creatures swarmed her, their unnatural speed and strength making them a formidable foe. Evelyn gritted her teeth as she fought to keep them at bay, every fiber of her being focused on reaching those doors. Just as she was about to cross the threshold, she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. One of the other survivors was making a desperate bid for freedom. Without hesitation, Evelyn doubled back and grabbed the person, pulling them through the doors and slamming them shut behind them. The two of them collapsed to the floor, panting heavily as the sounds of the infected creatures howling and slamming against the doors echoed all around them. Evelyn felt a moment of triumph at having made it this far, but it was quickly tempered by the sinking realization that they were now trapped in the very heart of the Reaper's domain, with no clear path to escape. Evelyn and the other survivor huddled in the dimly lit corridor, their heavy breathing the only sound that broke the eerie silence. They had managed to evade the hybrid creatures for the moment, but Evelyn knew it was only a matter of time before the Reapers found them. Glancing at her companion, she was relieved to see that it was the young man with the shaved head, the same one who had expressed his mistrust of Zara back on the streets. The young man met her gaze, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and determination. "Well, at least we're still alive," he muttered, "for now anyway." Evelyn nodded, grimly aware that their situation was far from secure. She moved to the door leading deeper into the compound, straining to hear any sign of movement on the other side. Pressing her ear against the cold metal, she caught the faint sound of voices, her heart sinking as she recognized one of them, Zara. Evelyn quickly motioned for the young man to stay quiet as she strained to make out the conversation. Zara's voice was laced with triumph as she spoke. "They're trapped like rats. I want every available man searching every inch of this compound until they're found." Evelyn's blood ran cold as the implication of Zara's words sank in. The Reapers were hunting them now, fully aware of their presence within the compound and determined to eliminate them. She turned to the young man, her expression grave. "We have to find a way out of here before they catch up to us." The young man's brow furrowed as he considered her words. "And just where exactly do you think we'll go?" He hissed. "We're surrounded by those freaks, and the Reaper's men were as good as dead either way." Evelyn opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, the sound of gunfire erupted nearby, her heart leaping into her throat as she recognized the distinctive report of the Reaper's weapons. She grabbed the young man's arm, pulling him down the corridor. As they fled from the approaching danger, Evelyn's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan to get them out of this nightmare. But the stark reality was that they were severely outmatched and outgunned. As they rounded a corner, Evelyn caught sight of a group of Reapers up ahead, their weapons trained on a lone figure. Evelyn felt her breath catch in her throat as she recognized the man at the center of their crosshairs. It was one of their own companions, the betrayal cutting her to the core. The Reapers opened fire, and Evelyn watched in horror as her former ally crumpled to the ground, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. The young man beside her let out a strangled cry and Evelyn had to restrain him from rushing forward. She could see the fury and grief written across his features, and she knew he was struggling to come to terms with this latest betrayal. "We have to keep moving," Evelyn hissed urgently. "If we stay here, we're next." The young man hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting between Evelyn and the fallen survivor, but finally he nodded, his jaw set with grim determination as he followed her down the corridor. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as they ran, flanked on all sides by the ever-present threat of the Reapers and their twisted creations. Just as they reached a set of double doors, Evelyn heard the unmistakable sound of more Reapers approaching from behind. She glanced at the young man, desperation creeping into her voice. "We have to make a stand here. We can't keep running forever." The young man's expression darkened as he nodded in agreement, the two of them bracing themselves for the coming onslaught. Evelyn knew that their chances of survival were slim, but she refused to give up. Not when they had come this far together. They would face the Reapers head-on and fight for their chance at freedom. Evelyn and the young man stood their ground as the Reapers closed in, their weapons at the ready. The sound of the approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor, sending a chill down Evelyn's spine. She gripped her gun tightly, her knuckles turning white as she steeled herself for the coming battle. The Reapers emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on the two survivors. Evelyn felt her heart pounding in her chest as she stared down the barrels of their guns. She knew their chances of survival were slim, but she refused to go down without a fight. Glancing at the young man beside her, she saw the same fierce determination burning in his eyes. The leader of the Reapers, a tall man with a hard gaze, stepped forward, his lips curling into a cruel smile. Well, if it isn't our wayward guests," he sneered. "You've caused us quite a bit of trouble, you know." Evelyn raised her chin, defiantly refusing to be cowed by the man's taunts. "It's over," she spat. "Your twisted experiments, your hybrid abominations, we're going to stop all of it." The Reaper let out a harsh laugh, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "Stop it," he scoffed. "My dear girl, you've only just begun to see the true extent of our power." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine as the implication of his words sank in. The Reapers had been planning this all along, their sick experiments, just the beginning of a much larger scheme. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the sound of an explosion rent the air, followed by the screams of the infected. Evelyn and the young man whirled around to see a horde of the hybrid creatures spilling into the corridor, their unnatural speed and ferocity a terrifying sight to behold. The Reapers turned their attention to the new threat, opening fire, but their bullets seemed to have little effect on the twisted abominations. Chaos erupted all around them as the hybrid creatures surged forward, their gaping maws snapping at anything within reach. Evelyn and the young man were forced to duck and weave narrowly, avoiding the grasping claws and slavering jaws. Evelyn's mind raced, trying to come up with a way to stop these monstrosities. Suddenly a memory flashed in her mind. Back in the Reaper's compound, she had noticed something strange about the hybrid creatures, a weakness that had not been apparent before. With renewed determination, Evelyn turned to the young man, her voice low and urgent. "Aim for the head, the brain, that's their weak point." The young man's eyes widened as he realized the implication of her words. Without a moment's hesitation, he opened fire, his bullets finding their mark with deadly precision. Evelyn followed suit, her own weapon barking as she took down one hybrid creature after another. Around them, the Reapers continued to fight, but Evelyn could see the growing desperation in their movements as their carefully crafted abominations began to fall one by one. The tide of the battle was turning, and for the first time since they had set foot in this nightmarish compound, Evelyn felt a glimmer of hope. As the last of the hybrid creatures crumpled to the ground, Evelyn and the young man turned their attention to the Reapers, the survivors now outnumbering their foes. The leader of the Reapers stared at them, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Impossible," he snarled. "How could you have discovered their weakness?" Evelyn fixed him with a steely gaze. "It's over," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Your reign of terror ends here." The Reaper's jaw tightened as he realized the futility of his position. Evelyn watched as he and his men slowly lowered their weapons, their defeat evident in every line of their bodies. As the dust settled, Evelyn surveyed the carnage around her, the bodies of the fallen scattered across the corridor. She felt a profound sense of sorrow and exhaustion, the emotional toll of their journey weighing heavily upon her. But despite the pain and loss, she also felt a glimmer of hope. They had survived the Reapers and their twisted creations against all odds, and now they stood at the threshold of the safe zone. Evelyn knew that the fight was far from over. There were still countless undead roaming the streets, and the Reapers were sure to regroup and come after them again. But in this moment, she allowed herself to feel a spark of determination. They would reclaim this world one step at a time, rebuilding from the ashes and ensuring that the sacrifices they had made were not in vain. Evelyn turned to the young man, a small smile spreading across her lips. "Come on," she said. "Let's go see what the future holds."